Okay, well, please join me in welcoming our panelists to Harvard Law School here. Thank you very much. And we've got about 45 minutes for the Q&A, so in the interest of time, I won't go through everyone's full bios and everything, but I just want to introduce the folks that you didn't see in the film. We have Scott Jurek here. This is Nirva Patel. She's one of the executive producers of the film. And then Nimai Delgado, who you saw featured. And we got Joseph Pace, who's not a producer and a main writer of the film, and who also has worked with Dr. Greger on a lot of nutrition info. We've got James next to him, who you're familiar with. And we've got David Goldman, who is the chief science advisor to the Game Changers film, and who also works as a sports dietitian and exercise physiologist for a lot of collegiate, professional, and Olympic athletes. And we've got Maria Wilhelm, who is the president and COO of Cameron Companies and the executive director of the Avatar Alliance Foundation. And on the end, we've got Dr. Jim Loomis, who you saw in the film, who is the team physician to the St. Louis Rams and St. Louis Cardinals, and is currently the medical director of the Barnard Institute in Washington, D.C., which is a division of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. So before we get into the substance of the diet, I want to ask both Nirva and Maria, from a business point of view, how you got involved in helping make the film, getting the film to where it is. None of the front mics are on, and we need them for the recording. Yeah, just hold on one sec so we can have them for the recording.
So I've been a vegetarian my entire life. I'm extremely passionate about the plant-based movement and removing animals from the supply chain. So when this film was happening, I figured out a way to contact the producers and got involved. This is our third film, our third independent film, but the one that I'm the most proud of.
Thank you, Nirva. Our commitment is philanthropic in nature. It is not about business. And when I met James and Joseph in early December 2013, and maybe even a little bit under duress, somebody called me and said, you got to, in Hollywood terms, and I'm not a Hollywood person, take a meeting with an ultimate fighter and an environmental researcher. And I was a bit resistant, but I met them and I thought they had an extraordinarily energizing and differentiated point of view, and one that could really send the climate message in a non-divisive manner. I think we're motivated by the inspirational and the aspirational. And I saw in their integrity, in their sense of purpose, in their principle, and in their passion, a way for us to engage with something that would not be an overly instructive, downer, the world is going to hell doc. And I think they achieve that. And somewhere someone should ask them about how long this took to achieve what they have done so magnificently. But with that, I just want to say it's an honor and a privilege to be involved in this effort.
Great, well, we will jump that. So next I'll ask both James and Joseph just about the process of how it started making the film, how long it took, and what brought you guys together and the team that you built.
So is this on now?
Yeah,
oh, yeah,
yeah.
Okay. So I literally, as you saw in the story, and I got injured. It was in 2011 actually, and tore ligaments in both of my knees, and started doing the research, and I basically bought a used camera off of Craigslist and called the director of photography from The Ultimate Fighter and started asking, what camera should I buy? And literally went on YouTube, learned how to do 3-point lighting, and started interviewing some people. It was very early stages, but very soon after that I met Joseph. And Joseph at the time was working with nutritionfacts.org, which puts out information regarding nutrition. And basically Joseph had been plant-based for maybe 25 years at the time, and based in academia. But we sort of just started working together, and you want to give a bit about your background?
Not so much about my background because it's kind of boring. But yeah, so I met James and sort of felt like I'd wasted the last 2.5 decades of my life, to be honest, because I just was in the middle of a 60,000 word report. I was a research coordinator with my wife, who has a master's in food systems theory, and it was the environmental impacts of food, rural communities, animal welfare, and rural communities, environment, animal welfare, and public health. So I was in the middle of that 60,000 word report with 25 different professors, and then I met Dr. Greger, and then he passed me off to James, or James off to me, and said, I don't know, this guy's a fighter, he's got questions about sports nutrition, and I had an interest in that because I'd studied a little bit, so I talked to him and hung up and said to Shannon, my wife, I've really wasted my time. I've got to refocus here. And originally James didn't even want to be in the film at all. He just wanted to explore the subject and just, sort of do it at piecemeal and see what we could come up with, and look at the mythology and look at the paleoanthropology and look at soy and look at, gluten and meat, and sort of kind of like was outlaid in the film, and it became something quite different quite quickly. I think we did an exploratory round of filming, which is right before we met Maria, and we put a little sizzle reel together. We'd never made a film, and I guess the stories in there were compelling enough that we thought we needed to elevate our game. Sorry to say it, put it that way. So we hired Luis Hoyos, who had won an Oscar a few years earlier for The Cove. And we didn't actually, when we met him, we didn't intend to hire him. We didn't think that would ever happen. We asked him his opinion on who we should approach as a director. And he said, well, why not me? And so we thought, okay. And we thought he would charge us like $1 million a year or something crazy, but long story short, he just basically said, I really believe in what you guys want to look into. I think the stories, James's story, Patrick, Scott, and then the other people that we met later are very compelling, and I think this is a chance to bring an issue to people that would never even think about it. Of course, it morphed over time. The science changed as the deeper we got into it and the more we challenged ourselves. So it was not a linear process at all. But that's how we did it, I guess. And it took 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. And everyone was pretty mad. Not necessarily the people at this table, but because it was a lot of money, and so a lot of our investors and funders and people supporting us were kind of like really, like 2015, 2016, but we knew the film, even going into Sundance, wasn't quite there yet. And we felt that this was our one chance, that there are so many issues on the line here, from health and the environment to animals, and it covers a lot of ground, literally, globally, 40% of the world's landmass. So we wanted to make the best possible version of it we could. So that's why it took so long.
And for David and Jim, can you talk a little bit about bringing science into a film and having it still stay compelling, and what you guys contributed to that?
Oh, that's a good question. Oh, that's a tough one. If I could have had it my way, I would have made the film 100% science.
I'm sure they're very compelling.
No one would have watched it. Exactly. It would have been so boring. Just, confidence intervals and p-values, and nobody would care. So I just brought as much science as I could, and James and Joseph told it in a way that is relatable and understandable, and so, you know, there are absolutely very, very sound scientific underpinnings, and we sort of brought it to life with the stories. But yeah, so I mean, playing a role on the science front was, I feel like I've been preparing for this for my entire life. I've been studying this ever since I can remember, so.
Yeah, and David's ruthless, by the way, with science. He would say, well, you can't, I mean, those studies on testosterone were total testosterone, but what really matters is free testosterone. So, like, whereas I think most filmmakers would have put plant-based people have higher testosterone, he's like, yeah, not really. It's the free, your body regulates, and it's about the same across the board, so you can't do that. And we'd be like, yeah, okay, that's fine. So
I was annoying. I was a crotchety grandpa who would.
Yeah.
But thank you for not firing me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, that would have been the worst thing we could do.
And Jim, you sort of like the old hair club ad where you're like, I'm not only the president, I'm also a client, where you talk a little bit about how you yourself, in addition to helping other athletes with this, you yourself embodied a lot of these values.
Yeah, so, in medical school, we all want to practice evidence-based medicine, but the evidence I was taught, in retrospect, was really the wrong evidence. And in fact, in many ways, highly flawed, because, it's funded by the food, by the drug industry, and on and on and on. And after living a lifestyle that I recommended to my patients, I became a patient, eating low-fat dairy and lean meat and such. And when I discovered, I saw Forks Over Knives and transitioned my diet and lost a ton of weight and dropped my cholesterol 100 points and worse sleep apnea and allergies, on and on. And when I started to do a deep dive into science, you realize the science has been out there for a long time, but it's just not what we're taught in medical school. And, nutrition research is notoriously hard to do because you can't do double-blinded controlled studies, which is kind of the gold standard, because you just can't do it. But, I think Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the politician, once said, we can all have our own opinions, but we can't have our own facts. Yeah. And so I was so impressed with, I can guarantee you, I don't know how long we were at Busch Stadium, a few hours, 4 or 5 hours. Afterwards, I sent James a paper to back up every single statement that I made in my interview. And in fact, there was a couple of things. James called me and says, hey, you said this, I just want to double check the science. And the science wasn't there, and we took it out. And so the integrity of the science in the movie was amazing. And I think, after like What the Health, there'd been some pushback about some of the statements that were made that may not have been so grounded in science. And so I think the attention to that, and David's diligence as well, really is what differentiates this documentary from any of the other health documentaries that are out there.
Great. And for Scott and Nimai, the athletes up here, we talked a little about the business school, but can you talk a little bit about your own decision, what triggered this, and what sort of pushback you got from your peer athletes in your various fields, and then if your own example has then led to more people kind of being interested in what you're doing and maybe even trying it themselves?
So I've been doing this for a while now, going on 20 years, and I grew up hunting and fishing in northern Minnesota. I was a meat and potatoes guy. My mother worked for the Minnesota Egg Council. So if you remember the incredible edible egg commercials, I was definitely not on the road to becoming a vegan by any stretch of the imagination. But for me, I really became interested from the health standpoint, and I wanted to keep my health going as long as possible. And in the end, I started realizing the effects of recovery. And when I was on this road, there were some in the endurance community that were more open to it. Endurance runners and ultra runners are definitely more eclectic, and they're a little bit more open to new ideas. But all my buddies thought I was crazy. I was the guy eating, rabbit food, and had all my different types of bowls with me when I travel. And I definitely was the odd one out. But I think the biggest thing is I was getting results on the diet. And it's hard to argue when you win over and over and over again, not just like by chance you win one time. So it definitely helped, I think, fuel the fire for other athletes too. I have other athletes from other sports say, hey, I started trying this. And people, I think, across the board were doing it because they wanted to live longer. They wanted to live healthy lives and be able to do the things they love, run, bike, go into the mountains and explore, or whatever it is. So I think that was really neat too. It's really about, I think, long-term health for a lot of people, and they want to stay active and they want to stay healthy. They want to see their grandkids, and that to me is like the bigger picture goal. Even though along the way I was getting effects of being able to perform year after year and win and recover, which I think was the big shift for me.
And when we say winning gets results, Scott here, some of his races are 150 miles long, and there's a 100 mile, the Western States 100 mile endurance run. He's run a record 7 times straight. So yeah, I mean, that definitely will get people's attention.
And there's a lot of things, like the argument, those of you who aren't convinced, I mean, there are a lot of aspects to athletic performance, but I think if you don't have one of the key ingredients, which is nutrition, you're definitely at a disadvantage. So I'm not going to say my diet is everything, but it's a big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and same like Nirva, I was born and raised a vegetarian, so kind of grew up in a very different environment in South Mississippi where it was the land of hunting, fishing, and barbecuing. So growing up, I was an outcast, and it was not something to be proud of to be vegetarian because you just everybody would nail you on the head for it. But it wasn't until I was 25 and I had just graduated college and I moved to California, and I got really into just lifting because it was my outlet. And I really started to discover a little bit more about nutrition and seeing how fuel could affect my recovery, my performance, my gains, everything. And just so happened that I stumbled across a video about the dairy industry, and at that time I was working as an engineer in a processing plant, and I saw the parallels behind the machinery, the gauges, the tubes, all of the contraptions that they were using in the dairy industry, and I thought to myself that there's another engineer that's working really hard to increase the profits of this industry, but at the expense of these living creatures. And just by buying those products, I was supporting that industry. So I essentially just decided right then and there that I wasn't going to support it anymore, and had no idea about the health benefits. So I just thought, okay, these are my new parameters that I have to work within, and dairy is no longer an option. And what I found was incredible, that my recovery time dramatically decreased. My strength went up, and everything that I thought I knew about nutrition was kind of, wrong, or not wrong, but just counterintuitive. And that's when I decided to do my first bodybuilding show, was just to prove it to myself, because I had heard my whole life that I needed meat to be big, to be strong, but growing up vegetarian, I knew that wasn't true. So the first show I didn't tell anybody, I didn't announce it on social media or anything, and I won the entire competition. I won against all categories and took home a ton of trophies. So afterwards, this question that I kind of avoided my whole life of what do I eat as a vegetarian, now became the first question that everyone asked me naturally after a bodybuilding show. What did you eat? And so I told them, I was well, I only ate plants. I was completely vegan, and they were just completely astounded. So I figured more people should know about this and just know that it's possible. There's a different approach that yields the same, if not better, results quicker, and also promotes longevity. There's a whole variety of different reasons why you could adopt this diet, but health seems to be the commonality behind everyone, because everyone wants to look good, everyone wants to feel good, everyone wants to be confident and spend more time with their family, add a few years to their lives. So within that industry, it was met with some resistance still to this day. I mean, bodybuilding is centered around eating lots of chicken, lots of whey protein, lots of eggs, lots of fish, and it's kind of the standard. So introducing a new approach it's interesting to see the evolution from the last 5 years, especially after the Game Changers. Now there's been so much interest in it that the biggest, most meat-eating heavy bodybuilders are now coming up to me asking me how to do it. So there's a big shift that's happening, so it's exciting times.
You said a lot of them actually felt terrible inside, even though they look good on the outside.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the irony behind bodybuilding shows, is that you see guys and females on stage and they look incredible. You can see their abs, you can see every vein. They look healthy, but on the inside they're rotting and they feel like garbage, and they walk off stage and they pass out. And in contrast, here I was just feeling great overall. I didn't have to change much of my diet. I just kind of changed portions of what I was eating, and I was beating everyone. I became the first vegan pro to compete at that level, and then first vegan on muscle and fitness. So it's just kind of breaking those grounds and just showing that it's possible.
Great. Shall we open it for the crowd? No. Great. So we'll take some questions. We've got one right here. Please wait for the microphones because we're recording.
First, I'd like to thank you all for your work, not only in the science, which I really appreciate, but also in the human inspiration. In just over 2 years of plant-based eating, I've gone from near wheelchair status to resuming an active life. So I am so grateful to you beyond the athleticism. So my question is, with the ongoing misinformation that continues to muddy the waters of nutrition medicine, it is already difficult to discern the facts of nutritional science. While this is true not only for the majority of the general population, it feels even harder to find sources of in-depth information relating to the unique additional needs of a person living with a rare genetic disorder like Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which I have. I've had 8 joint surgeries at age 58, and including ACL reconstructions of both of my knees, and I have ongoing damage from joint subluxations. Can you recommend to me any trusted sources where I could learn even more about designing my plant-based diet to optimize my health living with this condition?
So I don't know of any specific resources around EDS, although there is a guy named Tim Kaufman who's on social media, who is plant-based. He's in Buffalo, an endurance athlete who has Ehlers-Danlos, and he's a great guy. You can follow him on social media and reach out to him. He may have some more insights around the specifics. But what we do know is that, you know, as just like athletic performance, you know, a plant-based diet is highly anti-inflammatory. And when you've got these chronic musculoskeletal issues, minimizing the inflammation is key. And so, you know, Dr. Greger's site, How Not to Die, his book, How Not to Die, is fabulous. His website, nutritionfacts.org, is fabulous. Those are all evidence-based sources. Our organization, PCRM.org, is another great source for just general evidence-based information. The Game Changers has all the scientific references, and we'll be adding more and more content, again, evidence-based. Those are probably the go-to sites, don't you think, David? Yeah.
Okay, right here.
Thanks so much for your film. I also went vegan after watching it. It's a great film. I was just wondering, what is the biggest criticism and pushback that you get to the film, and how do you respond to it?
Honestly, the vast majority of it comes from the keto paleo community, and largely from trainers and people who sell supplements and training programs. Like, to be very honest, because we follow the they like to put our hashtags, or Game Changers movie, or the Game Changers, or whatever, just to see if they can bother us. But so we sort of see where the pushback is coming from. The rest is shockingly the opposite. We thought we wanted, when we were editing, we wanted to make a film that didn't exclude dude bro type guys. But in fact, a lot of 55% of our followers are men aged 18 to 35. The response from the military, firefighters, police officers, bodybuilders, football players is the dominant response, not just like, well, we get 20 emails and one of them is, it's almost like inverse to what would normally be in this space. So the main pushback, for example, like Men's Health, right out of the gates, the day that the film was released, they published an article written by a guy who sells books for them about how to make meat for men. And one of the people that they cited was a paid beef industry spokesperson. So we said, well, can we give you a rebuttal? And Arnold wanted to add something there, or was willing to, and they said no, which is basically pretty unheard of, especially when you're someone at that level. So we did a little digging, and I mean, they've come around a lot, so I believe that everybody should be given a second or even a third chance. And different Men's Health UK and New Zealand have made some shifts, but interestingly, Men's Health is owned by Hearst Corporation. They own like 30 magazines, and they also are they own the largest grass-fed cattle ranches in the United States.
Huh.
And they are the largest providers of grass-fed beef to like Whole Foods. So we started looking back through some of their magazines and noticing how dominant beef really is in Men's Health. I don't know if you've noticed, but much more than any other meat. I just thought, that might explain a couple things. It might not. We're not conspiracy theorists. It could just be that the author just really believes in eating meat, and it had nothing to do with some big agenda. But really, mainly it's from people who they really have are making money from it, or they have that's their job sort of thing. And the rest, pushback is pretty limited. It's shocking, honestly. We thought we'd be. Yeah.
One back there on the red.
So I guess we have you guys to blame for the Titans beating the Patriots in the playoffs. But there are a lot of good reasons, obviously, for not eating meat. But at the same time, there are a lot of fad diets that come along that seem to capture people's imaginations that aren't so beneficial. Right now, there's a lot of emphasis on gluten-free food, but only about 1% of the population has the celiac disorder, and about 5% are sensitive to gluten. And it may even be unbeneficial for many people not to eat whole grains and so forth. But how do you keep people from distinguishing really beneficial types of diets like meatless ones with really foolish fad diets like gluten-free that are only for a very tiny percentage of the population?
I'll let David speak to the science, but take gluten-free, for example. So there was a professor called Peter Gibson who started that whole craze accidentally by, doing a study showing that they thought that, the gluten was an issue even for people that didn't have celiac disease or a gluten sensitivity. What didn't get hit in the media was that he redid the study in, I think it was 2014, and with tighter controls, and realized it was no more than a placebo effect. So there's like a multi-billion-dollar industry created out of gluten-free foods, pushed by the media. And then when the study was redone by the same professor, that didn't really get much media coverage at all. So I think it's really unfortunate that the media can really have such an impact. They do this all the time with studies. So the study can say one thing, and then the media draws its own conclusions. That's really unfortunate that happens. Do you want to speak, David, to anything with?
Well, maybe the whole grains, though.
Oh, sure. Just in
I
terms
mean,
of.
you are correct about pretty much.
Yeah, I like the way you asked the question, because it seems like you get the sensationalism surrounding gluten and really that the resistant starches found in wheat actually improve gut health, and that gluten itself has been shown to boost immune function, and that the long-term outcome data that we actually care about shows that there's a protective effect of whole grains on heart disease and certain forms of cancer and diabetes and hypertension and obesity. So, I mean, you get it already, which is fantastic, and then we just have to help other people to recognize that some of the foods that they love the most, they actually don't have to rule out, because they can actually be health promoting. So, yeah.
Got one in the back corner there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I just have a quick question. If you know Dr. D'Adamo and his blood type diet, because I have an O positive blood, and they say that actually meat is good for an O type, but maybe that's poppycock. And if you could just say, does anybody benefit from meat? And also, just to get down to the specifics of diet, if a couple of you could give an example of just breakfast, lunch, and dinner, because here's all the science, but what do you actually eat?
So I'm going to let someone else handle what they eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But I will say, when I was a kid, my parents brought me to Dr. D'Adamo, and they told me that I absolutely had to eat meat, because of my blood type. And so I grew up thinking that was totally legit. What's really interesting, so a review of over 1,400 papers considered the whole notion of the blood type diet and does it actually hold water? And there was literally zero scientific evidence to support that whole notion. So it's a great theory, and I was so excited when the research actually started to come out on it because I thought that it was going to be legit. It seemed plausible. But when there's literally no evidence, there's one Norwegian professor who referred to it, quote, as a crass fraud. I mean, it was really sort of pulling the wool over people's eyes and made some good money, but it was as low integrity as, I mean, you would hope that if you postulated, you know, you put your theory out there and it turns out that there's nothing to support it, you'd hope you'd recall that, or, you know, but they didn't. So I hereby give you all the food powers that be that you can eat, you know, according to the science as opposed to Dr. Delgado.
And Scott and Nimai, do you want to talk about what you guys eat when you're sort of at the peak of your training, or the peak of your performance?
Sure. So for breakfast, I'm a big fan of smoothies, especially when I'm training hard to pack in more calories. I'm also a big fan of oatmeal, whole grain oats, and porridges. I know it's like kind of a boring way to eat, but A, it's cheap, and it's just great food to fuel your body, especially as an endurance athlete. And I also do a lot of fruit. I don't do a lot of juices. Over the years, I experimented with juices, but I feel like it's just better to eat whole fruit and just get the fiber too. So while I do smoothies to concentrate the calories, I also do things that take a lot of chewing. So breakfast is definitely a big important meal for me after a big long run in training, or even before a big workout. And then lunch and dinner, I kind of lump those together where they're built around a lot of vegetables. So sometimes it's a raw salad. Sometimes in the evenings it's steamed vegetables. Sometimes it's in stews. I'm a big fan of ethnic foods, so I think the best way to eat vegan or plant-based is to incorporate world cuisine. It just makes it more fun. And this is how people have been eating around the world for years and years. So sometimes it's Indian, sometimes it's Japanese. I'm not too rigid, but it might incorporate tofu, tempeh, denser soy products, but then a lot of beans, whole grains, and then a lot of vegetables. So I know it sounds like a quick way to summarize, but that's how I like to eat.
Yeah, I think you'll find that most athletes eat very similar to what Scott just said. I mean, it's really not that complicated. It's kind of ironic that most people look at a vegan diet as restrictive, but it's really limitless. It's the amount of foods that you can eat and the variety that you can eat. I wake up and I eat smoothies, oatmeal, pancakes, scrambles that are made from tofu, avocado toast. For lunch or post-workout, I normally do a nice big smoothie with tons of fruit, tons of carbs, which is another issue that most people have a phobia with, is eating too many carbs because under the assumption that it'll make them fat. But if you're eating whole food carbs that are as close to the source as possible and not highly refined, then they can be very beneficial for recovery, for performance, for fuel. Whether you're a bodybuilder, endurance runner, a power lifter, a cyclist, it doesn't necessarily matter. But it really is simple. I mean, when I'm prepping, I eat the same foods, just different portions. And I do manage certain macros, but that's only because my goal is a very specific look that requires me to peak to look a certain condition on stage for just a matter of a few hours. But beyond that, it's just eating the same foods every single day. That includes Thai food, Indian food, soups, curries, burritos, pizza, sushi.
His Instagram is really good to see what he eats. And it looks really good.
I got so tired of people asking me what I eat. I just made a whole separate Instagram and just said, go there. And people still didn't believe me, so I started putting the exact numbers of protein and everything else on the food itself, so you could see how many grams of protein are in there, because there's this notion that plant foods don't have enough protein to sustain an athlete or a bodybuilder, but the reality is people look at their food as they compartmentalize their food and say, this is my protein, so here's my chicken, this is my carbohydrates, so here's my rice, and then these are my fats, so here's an avocado or some sauce or something. But when you're a plant-based athlete, you look at your entire plate and you say, okay, here's 5 grams here, 6 grams there, 10 grams here. And a lot of the times, most of my meals end up being 30 grams plus protein without even trying. It's just about incorporating the right calorie-dense, protein-dense foods like legumes, beans, sprouted vegetables, lots of greens, pastas, I mean, you name it.
We got a lot of recipes on the website, and we're actually putting more up of, including the athletes that were in the film and the foods that they ate. So.
And I'll just say something like on the Appalachian Trail, I definitely didn't eat the model plant-based diet. I think I had 3 salads the whole time because there was all about how can I get the maximum amount of calories. So just Nimai mentioned, it depends on what I'm doing. Like on the Appalachian Trail, I would just dump, oil. And again, oil isn't something the average, individual should just dump onto their plate. But for me, I needed to get, 9 calories in every gram. And fat was the best way to do that when you need to get 6, 7, 8,000 calories a day, and I'm still burning through because I lost close to 20 pounds on the Appalachian Trail. So I just couldn't eat enough, and I ate a ton of food. So it just gets interesting. So
right here.
So hi, I've been at Harvard too long, so I have a lot of information. I want to ask all of you guys questions. One, I would love to have the movie include how do women get more orgasms through a plant-based diet, if anyone wants to do research. I think probably a lot of women would like to know that. Two, there's a lecture a long time ago I had with Dr. John Rady over at the School of Public Health, and he said, no carbs, not even quinoa. He meant no grains, not even quinoa. And he was talking, I think, about people who are not athletes, and just wanted to get a reflection on that. But maybe most important is my concern. My daughter's a weightlifter and coach and plant-based. And my concern is the amount of greenhouse gases we're creating from all the processing to make all the new types of plant-based foods. Turns out they're very high, and then we're putting all of our plant-based milks in those plastic bottles with the heavy plastic lids, which you can't recycle, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a cost to the processing. I'm really psyched that you both sound like you don't use a lot of those types of foods, but there is a huge market now for plant-based milk, and it turns out the processing and the CO2e emissions are very high for all this processed plant-based food, and what you have to say about that. So sorry, that's 3 things.
Well, I was just, can I just jump in and say though, one thing we try to do and that David sort of taught us is it's always compared to what is a big question we always ask, right? So the emissions from the livestock sector just crush the plant-based sector in almost every space. And even some of the more recent research that come out, some stuff that we were looking at the other day had some flawed methodology, but you just really can't compare those 2 subsets of food groups. There are some plant foods that would be worse for, say, just specifically emissions or water use. But if you look at the totality of it, because part of my background was in environmental food studies, so if you look at water use, water pollution, land use, soil erosion, desertification, then emissions, then air pollution, rainforests, you sort of add all of that up, you're going to be very hard pressed, with the exception of maybe palm oil. There's a few other plant-based foods that are pretty terrible in terms of the environment, but that gradation is pretty important, I think, to differentiate. And there's some people out there, because there's a backlash against the plant-based industry, that talk about almonds and how much water are being used. Well, that's partially because a lot of the almonds that are being used are being grown in a desert. So they take way more water than they would where they would grow naturally without irrigation. So I'm not saying that almond milk is good because it's not cow's milk, that it automatically isn't bad for the environment. But I just think it's important to remember that on that spectrum, the animal foods is almost always, in terms of its grand environmental input, it's often 20 to 100 to 1 in terms of its calorie output and the effect on those various nerdy things I just talked about.
It's also pretty easy to make your own plant-based milks with a high-speed blender and a filter, right? Like oat milk and things like that. It's very easy to make, and you can just get a glass bottle and put it in your refrigerator. I mean, I do that at home, and it's a lot easier than it sounds.
Got a question over here.
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Are we moving on to the next?
No, I think we should.
Oh, okay. Okay, wait, well, I'm sorry. Okay, wait, I'm sorry, hang on 1 second, because you asked 3. I'm gonna get at the other ones real quick. Well, not that quick. First, there absolutely is research looking at how consumption of more whole plant foods enhances female sexual satisfaction. That was the question? I really hope I didn't mishear that question. I just answered that. I was like, where is my mind?
Where's your mind?
So there's like a 70% chance I got that right. Anyway, but yeah, there definitely is data looking at that specifically, and it's compelling. So there's that one thing, and I could find that for you afterwards. I could find that study. Anyway, as far as the carbohydrates are concerned, you're talking about quinoa. So I really feel that when people are looking at carbohydrates, should I eat low carb, low fat, high protein, whatever, I think people are looking at the wrong metric. It's just, I really do feel food is far more complex, and the source matters so much more than these particular macronutrients. I'll give you an example. So a 2018 paper published from Harvard University, Dr. Walt Willett, who we had in the film, he co-authored this paper. It was a meta-analysis showing that people who are eating a low carbohydrate dietary pattern had a 20% increased risk of dying early, basically early death across the follow-up period of the study. But when you actually broke it down and took a look, how were people replacing their carbohydrates? What were they replacing them with? When they replaced the carbohydrates with animal-based sources of fat and protein, like bacon, then risk of all-cause mortality, risk of dying early, increased by 18%. But when they replaced those carbohydrates with plant-based sources of fat and protein, like nuts, their risk of death decreased by 18%. So you can see it's not like all carbs are created equally, not like all fat is created equally. That was just replicated in a study published just last month in the Journal of the American Medical Association, showing that there was no difference in risk of death, because I like looking at that outcome. It's the most relevant one, obviously. There was no difference in risk of death whether people ate low fat or low carb. It just didn't make a difference. What did matter is that when people were eating more animal-based saturated fats, their risk of death increased. And when people were eating more plant-based sources, again, of fat and protein, their risk of dying early decreased. So that's why when someone just calls out carbs in general, I would call bluff or something else. Yeah.
It was actually quite difficult to have de novo lipogenesis, where you're creating new fat from sugar or even carbohydrates. And so when you're on a high fat diet, you do burn more fat, but you also deposit more fat. So it's the net balance of that, right? So when you're on higher carbs, you might not be burning as much fat, but you're also depositing less fat because you're having less in the diet. So the sort of suggestion that carbs make you fat is, sure, if you're eating tons of sugar, it's highly calorically dense, you're going to eat more of it. But if you're eating whole plant foods, that's whole plant foods, carbohydrate coming from whole plant foods is tied to decreased body fat percentage, decreased waist circumference.
And underscoring the science, for those of you who aren't familiar with Walt Willett, he is the single most cited nutritionist in the world. He has over 1,700 published journal articles, so it's really impressive. But I'll get back to our question.
Hi, thanks very much for screening the film for us tonight, and thank you everybody in the panel for supporting it. My question steps away from the science for just a moment, and it's more about the hearts and minds. I noticed everybody on the panel here and in the film as well, the term plant-based diet is used a lot, and very rarely did we hear the term vegan. Is that somewhat intentional due to perhaps preconceived ideas or stigmas that might be associated with the word vegan? Or just general comments about that? Was that intentional or just happened that way?
So that's a really good question, and I think we also battle with which word usage to use. So we find that plant-based is more inclusive because you can be 80% plant-based, 90%. Vegans, I mean, I'm vegan, but I think it's tough for people to identify with that movement because we don't wear leather, we don't wear silk, our whole lifestyle is based on sentience. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the film, so I mean, if you look at the science, right, so the most important thing is getting the vast majority of your calories from plants, right? So we like to say it's it's all or something. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And a number of studies show switching from omnivorous to pescatarian to vegetarian to vegan has a benefit, but also even eating an omnivorous diet, shifting in a much more plant-based direction. And so, you know, plant-based diets, I'd say if you ate turkey on Thanksgiving and you ate, you know, a wild-caught salmon once a month, but the rest of your diet was plants, I'd still argue that you're on a plant-based diet. So vegan and vegetarian diets are plant-based diets, but plant-based diets aren't necessarily vegan or vegetarian. And so I think that the argument or the sort of proof between sort of 50% plants versus 95% is very easy to prove. And I do think that 100% is better than 95%, although to make that case is a little bit harder.
James and Joseph, can you, though, speak to the psychology of behavior change that was intentional and sort of underpins the film, which I think was part of the question that was posed?
Yeah, especially as we moved into the editing phase, we started looking at some things just didn't feel right to us. There were quotes, subjects that I mean, especially you, because I've been plant-based vegan for 30 years, and you'd just been at it for a few years, and we just had this intuition, and we started looking into the research and to see if it backed it up. And there were a number of behavioral psychological principles that sort of became very evident, things that you would intuit naturally that became a part of the film. And one of those would be the backfire effect, which you've all experienced, maybe haven't put the term on it, or the boomerang effect it's called, where, say, you don't believe in climate change. They've done research that shows that if you present, in as clinical a setting as possible, information that contradicts your belief, you will in fact believe what you originally believed more than before the information, because you're defensive. You sort of have a cognitive dissonance kicks in, and you become your defensiveness makes you more offensive, like you're on the offense now. Someone from, is it Valentine University, Dr. Rothberger, Bellarmine University, studied this with 18 to 24-year-old men and women, gave them information on the environmental impacts of food choices, the animal impacts, the health impacts, and followed up 3 months later, and the women were eating on average less meat and the men were eating more meat. And that's because something in them had kicked in, and there was a threat to their masculinity, because meat and masculinity are super tied up in our culture, and they react by having more of it. And you see commercials like that. I think there's even commercials that compare like Hummers to steak and like electric cars to tofu or something. But there are these sort of masculine associations, not just with food. So that was one of the things that we were very cautious about, was to not tell people what to do. And we also, I'm nerding out a little bit here, but the handicap principle was another one we became aware of. Most people probably know that young men in particular don't seem that concerned about their health. They may be about the way they look. Oh, not to single you out, but you know, but if you talk to the average traditional male, you know, for whatever that is, because we're all different. There's no regular person, but about cancer or heart disease, it's a nowhere conversation. Either they don't care, or they're going to think, well, I'm 50, I'll eat different, or whatever. But there's a principle called the handicap principle that shows that there are male animals that will they'll attempt to display their genetic superiority by engaging in high-risk behaviors. Like peacock feathers are cited as one example. The male peacock has a huge tail that actually is quite useless in many regards, but displays to its future mate, hopefully. I can carry this around, and this is how good my genes are, and I'm well fed. So you see it play out with young guys, maybe in 20-something, drinking and walking on a fence, and you say, that's unhealthy. Give me 5 of them. I'll eat 7 hamburgers and drink all I want. It's kind of like a display of masculinity and gene dominance. So our intuition, again, that's a little boring, but we sort of sensed that stuff as we were doing the edit, that we've got to be careful of this stuff because it becomes very isolating, very partisan. So we steered clear as much as possible of things that would force people to leave their identity at the door to join the plant-based club. We wanted there to be, and that's, I mean, we're very fortunate that it seemed to have worked in that I talk about how the number one sort of demographic that seems to be the most vocal about the film are these sort of traditional males, but honestly the spectrum is crazy. It's like, I can't think of a demographic, an ethnicity, a gender. The feedback we get is just, it's really, really strange. Like we really just can't find a group that's responding negatively to it. And I think that's in part because we did try very hard to not point fingers, tell people what they should eat, and not make it political and supercharged that way. So it's
James,
super long answer.
Following up on that, can you talk about some of the impact the film has already had just in the short time it's been out with various groups you've met with, and talk about some military procurement and other things?
A couple of things. We've had like 1.5 billion media impressions.
Wow.
How many news? How much news? 35,000 news articles online. And then according to Google Trends, the interest in plant-based eating more than tripled after the film hit Netflix. So I think it's had a really significant impact.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the military. They're taking a big interest. In terms of warfighter effectiveness, it's been estimated that also healthcare, they spend between $10 to $17 billion per year managing chronic diseases, largely which can be prevented and in many cases reversed by switching to a plant-based diet. So they're taking a lot of interest there in cost savings and performance with warfighter effectiveness.
Great. Well, we're about out of time. I'd just like to do a couple quick thank yous. First to thank Nirva and Patel for first reaching out to us and back in the summer.
Thank you to you, Chris, for everything you've done.
But Nirva, an article came out about our program, and Nirva just wrote and said, hey, I'm a lawyer, I live in town, I'd like to learn more about your program, and it led to another phone call, and then we got together with James, and then it led to this. And I'd also really like to thank some of the Animal Law and Policy Program staff, especially Kelly Reddy and Sarah Pickering for doing such great work to get this event off the ground. Thanks to our fellow Kate Barnacow and students. We've got Gabriel Wilgen, we've got Harish and Andy as well, who've been running around and helping everyone today. So thank you all for your help as well. And so thank you all, not only for being here, but for making such a great, impactful film and putting all the time that you all have into doing what you do and sort of leading by your own personal examples. It really has made a big difference, and we're very appreciative to have you here.
Thank you.
Join me in thanking Damon.
Chris, I just want to say thank you very much for helping organize this and also moderating at both Harvard Business School and here today at Harvard Law School. And again, thank you everyone for coming.
Yay.